Well, here at St. Peter and Paul this summer, we're studying the hymn book of the Psalms, which not only teach us to sing to our God, but they also provide us the language to speak to God. And it does so with a great variety of style. Week one, a couple weeks ago, we opened up to the book of Psalms with the very first psalm, which is kind of an introduction to the whole book and is technically a wisdom psalm. And that psalm made the case that before us, in this book, we have a practical guide full of wisdom. And that if we meditate on these words, if we incorporate them into our life, we will be made sturdy, strong, like trees planted. And one of the ways the Psalms does this is by giving us the language to speak to God amidst our varied life experience. So the Psalms teach us how to praise God and give thanks to Him, yes. They also give us a glimpse into Israel's history and even their liturgical worship. But they also, as you learned last week, give us even the language for complaint. And I imagine you probably picked that up in our reading you just heard today. We learned about this category last week called the Lament, which is the most common kind in the Psalter, by the way. And we're looking at another one today. Last week it was an individual lament. This week it's a communal lament. It's the grief of a nation, Israel, in the midst of some military defeat. Yet in a sense, all of the Psalms are actually communal. All of the laments communal, because even the individual ones, or when the psalmist uses his individual voice, pronouns like I, me, my, what we find in the Psalms is someone who's sharing our experience. We find a friend or a confidant, someone as we speak those words understands and has been through something similar to us. But the psalmist is not just a friend, he's also a counselor. The Psalms not only validate our experiences, but they give us faithful language to follow so that we can find the path out of our laments instead of just ending up in an endless cycle of complaint. No one does that, though. So let's follow the psalmist this morning. That's my invitation to you. In fact, if you want to open up a Bible, they're there for you in front of you, beneath the pews, or if you brought your own, we'll be in Psalm 44. It's on page 555 in those Bibles in front of you. And we're going to see three things in this psalm. We'll look at the trouble, what's kind of going on in the psalm. We'll look at the turn, where the psalmist turns his direction, and we'll look at the trust, the direction that he gives us in the midst of ours. So what's going on? Well, the psalmist begins by recounting the activity of God in Israel's history. And as he does so, he does this little compare and contrast between Israel and the nations. This is in verse 2. It says, and we'll throw it on the screen for you as well, you with your own hand drove out the nations, but them, that is Israel, you planted, you made them strong and sturdy. You afflicted the peoples, but them, again, Israel, you set free. And in these verses, two major stories from Israel's history immediately come to the fore, right? You have the deliverance from them out of Egypt, right? When the Egyptians were afflicted by the plagues of God, he outstretched that mighty hand against him. But Israel, he set free from that bondage and slavery. You might also think in the other verses of the conquering of the promised land, where God drove out the nations, but Israel, he gave the land which he had promised all the way back to Abraham. And indeed, the next verse seems to support this reading. Verse 3 says, "For not by their own sword did they win the land, nor did their own arm save them, but your right hand and your arm, the light of your face, did it, because you delighted in them." But consider for a moment what it must have felt like for the psalmist to sing these words. Because this isn't their experience, right? He's recounting a history of an earlier time. At present, the psalmist is experiencing the very things that the enemy was facing. Right? The psalmist says that they're the ones who have been driven out. Verse 11, you've scattered us from the nations. He says, we're the ones who are afflicted. Verse 10, you've made us turn our backs from the foe, and they have gotten the spoil. Imagine how it must have felt for the congregation to sing these opening lines, or for the psalmist to pen them himself when they were in the very middle of great difficulty or loss. And maybe you don't have to employ your imaginative powers all that strongly. Maybe, in fact, you can recall a time quite recently when you felt the same. When singing songs of praise in church felt like a betrayal to how you were actually doing. Each happy line pushing deeper the dagger that had already pierced you. Where you looked around at all the smiling, happy faces, only to deepen the pain that you were experiencing because of the circumstance that you were carrying. Maybe you stopped singing altogether. Maybe you're still in that place this morning. But look at the psalmist, because right out of the gate, he's going to teach us two things in just these opening lines. The first is that we can air our grievances. Did you notice how bluntly he speaks to God? Consider verse 9 and 13. He says, you have rejected us and disgraced us. You have made us the taunt of our neighbors. You ever pray to God like that? This is God's word. This is the psalmist giving us language to air out our grievances. Verse 4, he has the audacity to command God. God's the commander, and here he is commanding the commander. That's what that word ordain means. It means really to command. Command salvation for Jacob, which is just another code word for Israel. Deliver me. Do it. He even at one point makes an accusation against God that actually goes against other scriptures. When he says, you have sold your people for a trifle. Right? Saying like, we're not worth anything to you. Compare that with Psalm 116, which says the death of God's people is precious in his sight. Compare that line with Ezekiel 33, which says that God doesn't even delight in the death of the wicked. But at this moment in the psalmist's life, he feels as though his life is worthless. And he holds back nothing as he informs God of this. But these are the Psalms. And as Bonhoeffer pointed out in his commentary on the Psalms, there is in the Psalms no quick and easy resignation to suffering. They do not deny it or try to deceive us about it with pious words. They allow it to stand as a severe attack on the faith. There is always struggle, anxiety, doubt. The point? You can share what you're feeling and experiencing with God. He's big enough to handle it. He even invites it. But notice the second thing we learned from the psalmist. At the very same time, the psalmist is still singing. To sing those opening lines for the psalmist would be to take the blade and push it deeper. It's hard to look at the things that are hard in your life. It's difficult to face those things that bring you tears. We'd rather ignore it. But the psalmist won't do that. No easy resignation to suffering. But there's a balance here. See? It's not necessarily trite or inauthentic to sing praises to God in the midst of your troubles. Right? It doesn't mean necessarily that you're stuffing your feelings. The psalmist is doing it. You can do it. It's good, right, and salutary to do it. It may hurt to do so. But maybe the psalmist is demonstrating to us that our suffering is actually compatible with a God who has promised to love and protect us, even if it doesn't look like it in the moment. Don't let your anger or bitterness consume you. Don't deny it. Admit it. Recognize it. But recognize you can still praise in the midst of it. And that's the term for the psalmist. There's trouble, and then there's a turn. And that's actually the nature of the human heart, by the way. This is the dynamic for all humanity. When it comes to trouble in our life, there will be a turn. Our hearts, they will turn toward something. And I'm not speaking here so much about like little troubles and where we turn for those, right? It's also true that humans are pretty resourceful. And so you can turn towards lots of things that will maybe alleviate the suffering you're going through. This weekend, my daughter was distraught because she got a flat tire on her bike. And it was troubling to her. And it was troubling to me as her father. Although she may not have recognized that it troubled me during that time. She might have thought the speed with which I rectified that issue wasn't fast enough, but I noticed. But you see, what I did there is, yes, I turned to some resources, right? There's resources that can help us in trouble. And I went to maybe the most popular resource these days. I went to YouTube, watched some videos. Then when I got done with that, I actually looked up how to help my daughter with this bike. I'm not a perfect father. No, I'm just kidding. I went to YouTube specifically for bike fixing videos. And we fixed it, and she was riding it last night. The turn I'm talking about, though, and the turn for the psalmist here, is in those greater, more difficult experiences that life throws at us. Right? When you get the diagnosis, or when that habit that you've had no longer seems to be under control. It's starting to break out into different relationships, and it's starting to really hurt those relationships. When the one who promised to love you leaves you. When that trouble hits, we're going to find ourselves looking to something. It's the pattern of the human heart. But my guess is that when you've seen this happen or play out in your life or in the lives of others, I don't think the term idol probably shows up like with great speed for you. Like that's not a word that we use commonly in our culture in language, this idea of an idol. But that's exactly what the biblical account gives us as a word to describe for the thing that we look to in the midst of trouble. This is how Martin Luther put it in his explanation of the first commandment. We'll throw this on the screen for you as well. He said, "A God is the term for that to which we are to look for all good and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God is nothing else than to trust and believe in that one with your whole heart. As I have often said, it is trust and faith of the heart alone that make both God and idol. It just depends which one you're turning toward." I remember actually quoting that, paraphrased it, around a campfire when I was hanging out with a couple of my non-Christian friends some time ago. And as I got done laying it out, my one friend said, "So wait, I'm my own God?" Yeah. He understood the premise. He realized what Luther was getting at, who he looked to in the midst of his trouble for the good of his life. And maybe by that time in his life, he hadn't experienced troubles that were beyond his scope. And maybe he felt like he was kind of handling everything just fine on his own. The psalmist acknowledges that tendency too. Look at verse 6. He says, "For not in my bow do I trust, nor can my sword save me." See, the psalmist recognizes the natural inclination of the human heart to turn towards itself in the midst of trouble or difficulty. I can do this. I can fix it. I can make it right. I can pull my life together. And when that falls through, then there's often the turn towards coping mechanisms. Drugs, alcohol, pornography, online shopping. They don't all have to be bad things. That was Luther's point. It's anything that you turn to as your refuge, protection against that which is coming at you, maybe relief from the pain. You can even turn to religion. It goes something like this. I'm in a bad spot, right? I'm experiencing some difficulty, some suffering. Things are kind of falling apart, and I start to think, well, I've got it figured out. It's because of that thing I did. I must have done something to get on God's bad side. And so now he's sending down this wrath on me. And so what I got to do is I got to get to church. And I got to pray, and I got to get clean. And I got to get religious and get involved. And if I just get religious, then God will relent from me. He'll draw that hand off of me. My friends, that's not the gospel. That's religion, and that's oftentimes how people confuse Christianity for, but that is not the gospel. And is it true that we get ourselves in circumstances at times because of our own actions? Well, of course. That's just reality. But know this, especially if you're in the midst of it right now, that is not God punishing you. And look at how brilliantly the psalmist avoids this. Verse 17, he says, all this has come upon us, this disaster, though we have not forgotten you. We have not been false to your covenant. See, he doesn't go down that wrong path of assuming there must be something wrong that I did. Verses 20 and 21, if we had forgotten the name of our God and spread out our hands to a foreign god, an idol, any of those things we said earlier or other, would not have God discovered this? The psalmist knows that he can't hide that from God. He can't get away with murder, if you will. No, the psalmist knows who his God is, and he turns that direction. Where do you turn in the midst of your troubles? When calamity strikes, if you're in the middle of it right now, where are you looking? But the observant skeptic still recognizes, hold on a minute. The psalmist is doing everything right, but he's still in trouble. What's the point of following the psalmist's way, right? Why should you not start looking elsewhere for help and for rescue if God's not going to act? The revolutionary idea comes in verse 22. In the psalmist's heart searching, he comes to a unique conclusion about his situation. That suffering and calamity are not signs against wrath, not signs of God's wrath toward the psalmist, but are rather battle scars because of his connection with God. The price of loyalty to God in a world that is at war with him. For thy sake, it says, for God's sake. They've been bearing this load. They've been killed all the day long. Battle scars. And as bad as that may sound, it's better than the alternative, which is the worst fear for the psalmist. He alluded to it back in verse 3 when he said that the victory of Israel came through the light of your face because you delighted in them. See, that might suggest that the current defeat means God no longer delights in them. But remember, the psalmist is not going to go there. He's not going to end there. And somehow, he's got this revelation in the Old Testament, of all places, that God won't act that way. And he's going to trust it basically because of God's name, because of his character, because he believes that God is steadfast to his promises and to his covenant. And therefore, he knows that God can also switch things in a moment. With God, anything is possible. He can turn the tables. He can shift the war. If he just rouses himself, he can turn the tide. God can do anything. He can cure the diagnosis. He can heal the wound that's underneath all of those going to that habit pattern. he can, by his love, take our wounded hearts and make them capable of loving again, even when they've been torn and ripped. At the end of the day, the only real loss possible is the loss of God's love. Everything else is only lost for a moment, for a season, but it will be utterly restored by God, whether in this life or in the life to come. Which is why Paul, in the New Testament, he picks up this very psalm as like a proof text for that reality. He says in Romans 8, "What then shall we say to these things? God is for us, who can be against us? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Why? The psalmist could only hang on to this hope through his trust in God's name. But do you see the benefit we have as New Testament people? We can hold on to hope not just because of God's name, but because of God's Son. And because of what he demonstrated in his life, death, and resurrection. A great reversal. The innocent one, Jesus, him being slain all the day long in our stead. And rising to conquer death and everything beneath it. Why then the suffering? We may never see the reason God has for it, but you can know that God is not trifling with you. Maybe God is using this experience to prepare you for something down the road that you don't even know is coming. Remember Joseph in the Old Testament and how his suffering led to the salvation of his family and many people in Egypt. Maybe the suffering you're experiencing today is forging in you an empathic heart so that when someone else down the line finds himself in a very similar situation, you can serve as a refuge for them when they're on the brink of abandoning their hope. Maybe God is using this experience to expose your idols, not to punish you for them, but to show you what it is you're really turning to in the midst of difficulty, to drive you further into his arms, his security, his love for you. No matter what the reason is, because of what Christ went through for us, we can know that is not God's wrath or punishment. God has not abandoned us. In Jesus, we see that God is with us in our suffering. I'd like to close this message today with an old lumberjack story. There's a story of a lumberjack who once was out in the woods, and he looked up and he saw a bird making a nest in the very tree he was about to chop down. And so out of his mercy, he turned that axe around and he started beating against the tree and clobbering the trunk to shake it. Bird's up there, getting a cerebral hemorrhage. So finally, it flies out and makes its nest in the next tree over. And the lumberjack says, "Oh, goodness. I'm not just taking down this tree, right? I'm here to take down this whole woods, actually." And so he goes to the next tree and he starts clobbering it again. And the bird flies out and he goes to the next tree and he keeps pounding and pounding and hammering this bird, just haggard, Until finally the bird flies up and it builds its nest in a rocky outcropping. Why does God shake your trees? Because every single one of them is coming down. Everything is coming down. Everything is going to be shaking and shaken. My body is shaking, right? I'm going to grow old and fall apart and die. Relationships shake and they break. Eventually, the whole cosmos, our planet and everything else is going to burn up. It's all going away because of the weight of sin. But on the cross, Jesus took that disintegrating power of sin on himself. He was shaken so that you and I could stand firm. Are you shaking? Give it to the Lord. Turn to him and see his goodness for you through the rock, Jesus. Amen. I invite you to stand as we continue.